Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. Welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I'm Progress Texas Advocacy and Development Coordinator, Tana Mowens. Here at Progress Texas, we amplify progressive values, leaders, and actions. Through our no paywall podcast and digital media, we reach millions of Texans monthly. And that's made possible by folks like you who invest in independent, progressive media by Texans for Texans. Today, we are here to talk about water. Between the data center boom and Corpus Christi on track to becoming the first modern city to run out of water and other regions at threat of drought, this crisis is on everyone's minds. Lots of fear and mis or disinformation too. So to give us some key facts and some reality checks, maybe some calls to action, we have Water Program Coordinator for the Lone Star Sierra Club, Dr. Evgenia Spears, joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. And for a point of reference, Dr. Spears joined Sierra Club's Lone Star chapter as a water program coordinator to advance the protection of water resources and advocate for a future where water symbolizes harmony, justice, and shared responsibility. So very much needed. And I will push our listeners to recall last legislative session and the one before the 89th and the special sessions that we all had to suffer through. Water was a big focus back then. It is for our policy people and beyond a major concern because everybody drinks water, industry needs it, energy needs it. It is a bipartisan issue for a reason. So to start us off with water in Texas and then moving into a couple of specialized areas of expertise from Dr. Spears, would you start us off with a brief overview of the state of water in Texas? What are we looking at in terms of infrastructure, supply, demand, threats?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll get it straight to the point. Texas is experiencing a severe water crisis, and it's driven by several factors. First off, our state is growing. So we're talking about population increase. We are currently, I believe, at around 32 million people. And based on the projections, by 2080, we will reach over 52 million people. And the more people live in Texas, the more water we'll need. It's as simple as that. So next factor is increasing industrial demand. As you mentioned, we have these emerging large volume users, data centers, right? And we also have the industries that have long existed in Texas, like oil and gas industry. They all require water as well. And finally, the third factor is climate change. We're observing hotter temperatures. Our droughts becoming longer and more intense, and our reservoirs evaporate, our aquifers don't recharge with the same speed that they used to, and precipitation patterns are really no longer reliable. We don't receive as much rain as we used to. So all of these factors strain our water supplies. And the Texas Water Development Board recently released the draft 2027 State Water Plan, which is a major strategic planning document for our water resources. And they had a hearing on the State Water Plan, receiving public testimony. But that plan included several important numbers, and one of the issues that I want to share from the plan is that water demand in Texas is expected to increase by 6% by 2080, while water supply is expected to drop by 10%. So you're already sensing the gap. So we have this water deficit that we're dealing with. And as you mentioned, Corpus Christi is in the introduction, that's probably one of the clearest examples of or illustrations of water challenges that Texas experiences, because that region is literally running out of water and is trying to navigate quite serious water crisis while also supporting industries which use more than half amount of water available in the region. And so what's happening in Corpus Christi is really an example of how Texas has aggressively pursued industrial growth for decades, but environmental limits and long-term water availability haven't always carried the same weight in that decision making. And now what we're seeing is that communities people, everyday Texans, are dealing with the consequences of that poor decision making by facing water shortages, water conservation requirements,
degraded water quality too, right? Like with talking about data centers, this is of course pulling from drinking water, municipal water supplies, industry pulling from what everyday Texans need for their own sustenance and survival. Pictures have come out from those who live near data centers and their water comes out brown. And I mean, you can't imagine all of the different hazardous materials that are also included in that, but so many different threats and costs to talk about when we consider water in Texas and what it means to be in a deficit. So thank you for pointing us towards Corpus Christi. Certainly what comes to mind for many of us thinking about water in Texas today. I'd like for us to move into the discussion of water desalination. It's one of the proposed solutions to the crisis on the coast, and it's often framed as a silver bullet, the panacea, right? It's going to fix everything here, but the reality is more complex, as y'all put it. There are benefits, there are costs, but I'd love to hear from you as the water program coordinator, knowing the expert things here, to talk about what water desalination actually is. Give us the explanation.
Yeah, so seawater desalination is the process of removing salts from seawater. And typically, in that process, you recover 50% of fresh water and 50% is salts, byproduct of seawater desalination that's called concentrated brine. There's definitely some irony to it that Texas sits next to the Gulf of Mexico, yet we're running out of water. And so, as you said, seawater desalination is presented as a silver bullet, but you also mentioned that it's not as simple. And there are several reasons for that. First off, it's seawater desalination is expensive, requires a lot of energy to remove salts from seawater. And it's also considered a high impact strategy in terms of impacts on communities and impacts on the environment. If you think about communities, seawater desalination, if not done right, can harm local economies that depend on healthy coastal ecosystems, recreation, and local culture. We really have a very unique coast here in Texas, and it's definitely part of the Texas identity. And if we are not responsible, if we are rushing ahead of policies, ahead of science into seawater desalination, we risk harming all of these unique values.
Would you give a couple of examples of what some of those impacts look like on a community, on local ecosystems? What does industry for water desalination produce?
Some of the environmental impacts are associated with the discharge of concentrated brine, as I explained, that it's byproducts of seawater desalination. It has to go somewhere. It's generated through this process, especially if we talk about large-scale seawater desalination, we end up with a lot of concentrated brine. So it has to go somewhere. And the cheapest way is to dispose of it by discharging it into basin estuaries. But our basin estuaries are highly abundant in aquatic life. They are highly productive aquatic ecosystems. In fact, the most productive aquatic ecosystems in Texas. They support habitat for federally endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, who rely on certain salinity levels in basin estuaries to reproduce and to find food as well. And so if facilities start discharging large volumes of concentrated brine into our basin estuaries, we may disrupt the salinity balance in basin estuaries, and that would put stress on our coastal ecosystems. And in terms of mitigating these effects, well, Texas doesn't have surface water quality standards for salinity right now. So currently we have 8 proposals, seawater desalination proposals in Texas. We don't have any operational seawater desalination facilities, but there are 8 proposals. 5 of them are proposed to be located in Corpus Christi. So let's say one day all these 5 proposals become actual facilities, they start discharging concentrated brine into basin estuaries, then we may have a serious problem, because without surface water quality standards, we can't really assess cumulative impacts of all of these facilities discharging concentrated brine. So that is a big policy gap. And our major environmental regulator in the state, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ. We heard that they were going to work on standards for salinity, but we haven't even seen draft. Meanwhile, proposals for seawater desalination are increasing. We have 8 state-funded proposals, and we have also at least 3 privately funded proposals. So it's important that, we do it responsibly. And another environmental impact is associated with how we and where we intake water into the system for seawater desalination. So if we do it from the bays and estuaries, as I said, there's lots of marine life in our bays and estuaries. So we risk situations that are called impingement and entrainment. Both are related to harming marine life. Impingement is when larger marine organisms are stuck against the screens of intake pipes that draw water into the system. And entrainment relates to smaller organisms being sucked into the system with the force of water as it's being drawn into the system. And if any organism that's sucked into the system will die. So we do have a solution in Texas. In fact, we have a study that was done by Parks and Wildlife and Texas General Land Office back in 2018 after the passage of House Bill 2031. I believe it was the 84th legislative session. And the study was Texas specific. The goal was to streamline permitting and to identify zones that are environmentally suitable for these processes like brine discharge and intake or seawater diversion. And the general recommendation is that the best places to do that would be zones identified generally 3 miles offshore into the Gulf of Mexico. But you can imagine that requires additional infrastructure. That additional infrastructure comes with a price tag.
Exactly. Actually, that is a perfect segue into one of the other questions that I think looms large over water in Texas overall, and also regarding water desalination. So last legislative session, we had the Texas Water Infrastructure Impact Fund. I forget the exact name, but we all know like major legislation was put forward, and we're still really worried about if that's going to be enough. Would you talk about the cost, like the price tag for water desalination in Texas with these 8 proposed projects, and what would this really entail in terms of infrastructure and the cost for it?
I looked into it and compared the costs between the 2022 State Water Plan and the draft 2027 State Water Plan. In 2022, we had 7 seawater desalination proposals with a price tag of $2.8 billion. And right now, we have 8 proposed seawater desalination facilities, and the price tag has grown nearly 4 times. And we are at the total cost for all 8 projects of $11.2 billion. So
Woof.
that's these projects are very, very expensive. And you mentioned that last legislative session, we passed a major legislation that would fund these kind of projects. And I would like to add to that in fall, our voters, Texas voters, supported Proposition 4 that resulted from that major piece of legislation. And Proposition 4 unlocked the historic funding for water infrastructure. So starting, I believe, fall 2029, we'll have $1 billion available for water infrastructure projects each year for 20 years. So we're essentially talking about $20 billion for 20 years. Of course, part of that money would go towards funding seawater desalination projects. So we have the funding mechanism in place as well to facilitate the development of seawater desalination. But our policies and science are so far lagging behind, and that's the reason for concern.
One of the things that the Sierra Club shared when the state water plan came out is that the science, we are working against unpredictable climate patterns. And with that, when we're building potential solutions to address this crisis in Texas, the science is really difficult to pull together in terms of what policies will be the most cost efficient, what will impact communities the least or in the best possible way. So I'd also like to continue this conversation on the legislature and talk about what some of the other legislation surrounding water desalination has entailed and who would regulate this going forward, who would be in charge of ensuring that projects would be managed efficiently.
Yeah, so last legislative session, we also had a very important bill that's related to seawater desalination, which was filed by Representative Penny Morales Shaw, and it was House Bill 3728, that would have directed TCEQ to establish standards for salinity to make sure that seawater desalination brine discharges don't harm our aquatic ecosystems and just impact our economy as a whole. The bill didn't pass, and at that time, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality was saying that they were working on standards for salinity and that they were going to have a public meeting specifically on this topic sometime last summer 2025, but that hasn't happened. And then officially, finally, TCEQ scheduled that meeting at the end of February of this year, but they canceled it just about a couple of weeks in advance before the date. So we, as far as TCEQ, who will be the agency reviewing and who are actually the agency reviewing these permits, we haven't heard anything on salinity standards. They review impacts on salinity permit by permit, but again, it's insufficient because we are risking to miss the cumulative impacts of those facilities if we go individually permit by permit. As far as seawater desalination, last legislative session, there was another bill also, and I'm forgetting the number. It was filed, but again, I don't think it even received a committee hearing, but it would have addressed situations like I discussed, impingement and entrainment, to make sure that the regulations around seawater diversion are clear and strong. Quite often when you witness the conversation at the legislature or at the regulatory space in Texas, you can hear some decision makers saying that other countries are doing seawater desalination, so Texas can do it too. I want to point out that it's not necessarily that easy to replicate in Texas because of our unique geography. If you picture the Texas coast, we have a barrier island system that makes our basin estuaries semi-enclosed, meaning that the water is not mixing as fast, or the water mixing energy is not as high compared, for example, to the water mixing energy out in the Gulf. So as a result, if discharges of concentrated brine go into our basin estuaries, they're not able to be mixed with the water as easily. And what happens is that since concentrated brine is so heavy in salts, it'll go down to the bottom and would accumulate and linger, which can potentially lead to the phenomenon called dead zones, the zones that are that don't have oxygen that's needed for aquatic environments to continue being productive, to continue being, so to speak, alive. So therefore, the best course of action, the scientific recommendation that was made for Texas specifically is to do discharges and concentrated brine discharges 3 miles offshore into the Gulf. And as I mentioned, it comes with a price tag because it requires substantial infrastructure.
Thank you so much for that added piece of absolutely. It is talked about. I remember Governor Greg Abbott talking about, well, other countries have, and he's visited other countries that have done, he's visited water desalination plants as that kind of false comparison when Texas is a unique place, as we've all stated. We have our own infrastructure environment to consider. So thank you for that extra context there. So we've noted how next legislative session impending on all of us, water is obviously going to be a major point of discussion, and water desalination probably also going to get traction. As we kind of close out on this topic for this episode, is water desalination that silver bullet? Is it a realistic solution to the water crisis in Texas? Or where do we really stand in terms of, even if these proposed projects get put into place and even if they are efficient and not hazardous to nearby communities or wildlife, where does that leave us?
Yeah, so seawater desalination is not a silver bullet for Texas. our position is that water conservation, water loss mitigation, reuse have to remain foundational water supply strategies for Texas. And seawater desalination, we need to be very careful about it, because we're not just talking about infrastructure. We're talking about people's livelihoods, quality of life along the coast, well-being of our environment, marine life. And simply if we get it wrong, these impacts won't just stay on the coast. They will ripple across the state. And that's what at the Sierra Club we're trying to communicate to all Texans, that seawater desalination can play a role in the water supply portfolio of Texas, but we need to be very careful. We need to do it right. We need to do it responsible, especially if we want it to be a long-term strategy, water supply strategy for Texas. Then we need to make sure that it's sustainable in terms of its impacts on the environment and in terms of its impacts on our communities. We also need to ask who seawater desalination will benefit. Are we producing water for people, for the well-being of people, or are we producing water for industries? At the Sierra Club, we strongly believe that the water should support everyday Texans, Texas residents, and local businesses along the coast, schools. The water should be for people.
Absolutely. And for nearby ecosystems, the way it is supposed to be. And yet we have this really misaligned relationship with industry, especially along the Gulf Coast, where oil and gas looms so largely over everyday life. You noted the importance of remembering who water in Texas is for. I have, like so many of our listeners, family on the coast. My little cousin, which I still can't believe is my little cousin, is having a baby, bringing a kid into this world who will need to drink water like all of us. We went to the coast growing up. This crisis that we are only focusing on Corpus Christi and nearby regions like Three Rivers and other people who depend on the municipal water supply for Corpus Christi will come for the rest of the state of Texas. And that's why we need to be clear about where we really stand when it comes to water and proposed solutions as well. It can't be just water desalination fixes it all, because we are going to be left in a dangerous state, more so than we already are. Fear cannot be what we're left alone with.
Yeah.
We can't just sit around and think that this is going to fix it all for us.
Absolutely. And, I didn't grow up in Texas, but I moved here about 20 years ago. And one of the first places that I visited was the coast. And I was able to see the firsthand how people are connected with the coast, and, people swimming, fishing, playing with the kids, running along the beach. It was definitely a clear view of how Texas culture and identity is connected to this unique coastal area. So water conservation is the most sustainable, it's the most affordable strategy that has been working in Texas. Water loss mitigation as well. So, for example, there was a recent report stating that Texas loses about 186 billion gallons of water each year. So that's a lot of water that we already treated and paid for, but it never made to our homes. So reclaiming that water, fixing those leaky pipes is actually a good strategy. It's we can argue it's a new water supply, because otherwise we didn't have it available. It leaks through the pipes. So water conservation, water reuse, it was good to see water and wastewater reuse as under new water supply strategy list in Senate Bill 7, SB 7, last legislative session. That means that water and wastewater reuse will be eligible for the stream of funding from Proposition 4. So we'll have consistent funding. So that's positive as well. Another sustainable strategy that I feel like requires more attention in the Texas water decision-making space is called aquifer storage and recovery. Basically, it refers to collecting water during the times of high precipitation, during the wet season, so to speak, and then storing it deep underground, and then take it out at the time of need during droughts. So that's another sustainable approach that would be helpful for Texas as well. And of course, there are other strategies that are being discussed right now by our decision makers. Some of them are more concerning, like, treating and reusing oil and gas wastewater that is known as produced water. That raises a lot of concerns as well, but it's probably a topic for a different conversation.
Yeah, listeners, you can search back. We had Bill Birch, former candidate for the Texas Railroad Commission, on for an episode on produced water. And let me just tell you, after having listened to our communications director, Chris Mosier's conversation with Bill, wow, that would not be good. That would not be the water I would choose to drink. And I hope no other Texan will be put through that. But yet, here we are. It's a
Right.
strange world where that's a
Right.
proposed option.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll clip the discussion there for water desalination. And I'd love if you would just tell our listeners a little bit about the Lone Star Sierra Club overall, and how listeners can follow along if they care about water in Texas, the environment overall.
Yeah. Sierra Club is the oldest and the largest environmental nonprofit in the nation. We have chapters in every state. The Texas chapter is called the Lone Star chapter. And here we work on a variety of environmental issues related to clean energy, clean air, climate resilience, clean and accessible water, which is down my alley of work. And in my work specifically, I focus on protecting water resources and advancing policies that reflect needs of Texas communities. And a lot of my day-to-day work involves connecting the dots between water policy, environmental protection, and the needs of everyday Texans. As far as the issues that we work on in terms of water, it includes water quality, water quantity, affordability, equal access to water. And the goal is to empower Texans, to help them engage in water decision making in a more informed, constructive way, to be more confident as they speak to water decision makers and as they voice concerns to whether it's at the Capitol, whether it's at the Texas Water Development Board or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or whether it's at the local community level. The bottom line is that we want to make sure that the voices of everyday Texans are represented in the water decision making.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that summary. Definitely, we'll have the link in the show notes for the Sierra Club to follow along with. Their crucial newsletter is one of the things that I myself have personally followed along with, because they send out calls to action. As someone who cares about the environment in Texas and water desalination and all the ticketed items we talked about today, they are such a helpful resource for any of the information you might need to get involved. So thank you, Dr. Evgenia Spears, for joining us today. And do you have any last thoughts or calls to action for our listeners?
I want to encourage all Texans, regardless where you're located, whether you're close to the coast, on the coast, or maybe somewhere in North Dallas, Panhandle, or doesn't matter. Just talk to your legislators about seawater desalination. If you have concerns, be sure that they are voiced. So reach out to your legislators, because seawater desalination is more than a coastal issue. Then another thing that you could do, if you're interested in water issues in Texas in general, or if you would like to learn more about seawater desalination specifically, I would invite you to join our Water for People and the Environment Committee. It's a really great space to become more knowledgeable about water issues. We invite speakers, guest speakers, to our monthly meetings, and our next meeting is on June 8th, and we'll talk about seawater desalination. We'll have a conversation about impacts on marine ecosystems. So should be interesting, and our meetings are via Zoom, convenient to attend at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. So I hope to see you there. And you can also explore our website to find out more about our water work and follow us on social media. I can assure you we always have interesting things to share on social media, along with public engagement opportunities.
Yeah, and also fun videos of other Sierra Club chapter members like Cyrus walking around the Capitol. I mean, it's a fun place to be. Follow their socials today, and of course we've got that link in the show notes as well. Okay, well then that's all we've got for today. I'm sure this will be a discussion item that we'll need Dr. Spears back for another time. Water is actually a part of everyday life, and so this is going to continue to be an important thing to talk about here. So here at Progress Texas, We're an independent, nonprofit, rapid response media organization. While campaigns come and go, we are the permanent home for progressive media and action in the Lone Star State. Please support our peerless work. Thanks for listening, and share this episode with a friend.